Welcome to Learn at Work webinars. This is a webinar sponsored by the journal Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation. I'm Karen Jacobs, the founding editor of Work, and I'll be the moderator today. So I'm going to turn this webinar over to our first speaker who will introduce himself. Phil, I'm turning it over to you now, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jacobs. We're glad to be here with you today, and thanks to everyone who's tuning in, whether in real time or asynchronously. It's great to have the opportunity to take part in this Learn at Work series. I'm Phil Rumrill. I'm a professor of counselor education and director of research in the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky. With me today on the panel are Dr. Beatrice Lee of Michigan State University and Deb Minton of the University of Kentucky. You'll see on the screen our colleague Dr. Malachy Bishop of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, co-presenter here, unavoidably detained and won't be able to join us today. We'll do brief universal access visual descriptions. I don't like describing myself physically, but I'm a 54-year-old white male. I have very little remaining hair, and what I have is gray. I have hazel-colored eyes. My pronouns are he, his, and him. I am wearing a red University of Arkansas golf shirt, and I'm in my office in a nondescript background behind me on the wall. Dr. Lee, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dr. Rumrill, for the introduction. My name is Beatrice Lee. I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State University. And description of myself, I am in my late 20s. I'm currently in my office, and I'm wearing a cream-colored blouse with a blue sweater. And that's about me. And I'll turn it over to Deb.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. My name is Deb Minton, and I'm with the University of Kentucky. I am a middle-aged white woman with blonde hair, and I am wearing a white blouse and brown sweater, and I'm looking forward to being here today. With that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Rumrill.
Thank you, colleagues. Next slide is an acknowledgement and disclaimer. We want to let you all know that the contents of this presentation were developed in part under a grant, the Vocational Rehabilitation Technical Assistance Center for Quality Employment, funded by the Rehabilitation Services Administration, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. We have the grant number there, and the federal government wants to assure you that the views that we express here in this presentation are our own, and they are not necessarily those of the U.S. Department of Education, and anyone listening should not assume endorsement of anything we say by the federal government. And Dr. Jacobs, I think they only, I don't think they only ask us to do that disclaimer on grants. I think that applies across the board, but they wanted us to qualify that before we got started.
Yes, and Phil, I'll be happy to do the disclaimer as well. And I was remiss in not introducing myself with a description. I like that you use middle age, so I think I'll be middle aged too, Phil. I have brown hair, brown eyes, wearing a red dress and red lipstick, and in my office at Boston University.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. Title of our presentation, Emerging Vocational Rehabilitation Strategies for People with Diabetes Mellitus, hereafter for brevity referred to as diabetes. And Dr. Lee, if we go on to the next slide after the disclaimer, we have a not rhetorical question: what is diabetes? And folks, diabetes is a chronic disease that happens when the pancreas does not produce sufficient insulin to metabolize blood sugar, or when the body does not utilize the insulin that is present in an effective manner. So that's kind of the general definition. Next slide, please, Dr. Lee. A little bit on incidence and prevalence, folks. We have an epidemic on our hands here in the U.S. and worldwide. And since the early 1980s, and really even going back farther than that, diabetes has been a growing public health concern. We've talked a lot about the pandemic, the COVID-19 virus, but if you look at what's happening with diabetes, you see that it is really one of our ultimate emerging disabilities. For example, in 2012, there were 29 million Americans who had one form of diabetes or another, this according to the American Diabetes Association. Now in 2023, we know that there are more than 37 million Americans living with diabetes. And folks, this is 11% of the populace of our country. This according again to the American Diabetes Association. By the year 2025, that's coming right around the corner, it's been projected that the worldwide prevalence for diabetes will be somewhere around 600 million people. So this is a public health crisis we have on our hands, and the numbers are increasing over time for sure. You go to the next slide, Dr. Lee. There are three main types of diabetes. Type 1, insulin, also called insulin-dependent diabetes, and this is when it used to also be called juvenile onset diabetes, but not any longer because it can occur at any age. But this is when there's simply insufficient insulin production in the pancreas. Pancreas does not produce enough insulin for what the blood needs to metabolize sugar. The type 2 is when the insulin is there, but it's ineffectively utilized by the body. Type 2 used to be called adult onset diabetes, also not any longer because this is occurring at any age. Then we have gestational diabetes, and this is experienced by pregnant women who do not have diabetes prior to their pregnancy. However, having gestational diabetes does increase one's lifetime risk of acquiring type 2 diabetes after pregnancy. So sometimes gestational diabetes goes away, but not necessarily. So the next slide, Dr. Lee, some risk factors for diabetes. We'll just sort of click these off in terms of type 1. In terms of type 1 diabetes, cause is not known, therefore it is unpreventable. This occurs most often during childhood, but not always, and the pancreas literally shuts down and does not produce sufficient and sometimes no insulin whatsoever. And so in type 1 diabetes, people are reliant on exogenous insulin in order to metabolize blood sugar and therefore to survive. Type 2 diabetes, we see that there are lifestyle factors that are linked to the acquisition of type 2 diabetes. It's not always caused by things like physical activity, poor nutrition, obesity, living in poverty, but there certainly are markers there. We know that people of color in the United States, particularly African Americans, Latinx people, Native American people, are 2 to 4 times more likely to acquire type 2 diabetes than are people of European extraction. Dr. Lee, I'm going to turn it over to you if we're on the right set of slides and have you talk a bit about some of the symptoms of this condition.
Thank you, Dr. Rumrell. So now we'll talk more about symptoms of diabetes. Some common initial symptoms of diabetes may include frequent urination, excessive hunger or thirst, fatigue, acquiring infections more than usual, slow healing sores or lesions, and blurred vision. The pancreas' inability to produce sufficient insulin to process blood sugar brings with various co-occurring disabilities and secondary complications for people with diabetes. Diabetes can cause damage to the heart, eyes, blood vessels, nerves, and kidneys. Heart problems and stroke often co-occur with diabetes, with 50% of people with diabetes die of cardiovascular disease. Neuropathy often causes pain and numbness in the extremities. And there's also decreased blood flow stemming from high blood sugar levels that cause skin ulcers, especially in the feet, that do not heal. These unhealed ulcers often necessitate amputations of the toes, feet, and legs. Blindness and visual impairments are also common comorbidities due to damage to the small blood vessels in the retina. And in fact, diabetes is the leading cause of blindness and amputations in the United States. Because of the chronic nature of diabetes and its multiple and severe medical accompaniments, people with this disease are prone to experiencing mental health and interpersonal problems such as depression, anxiety, feelings of hopelessness, family role strain, and extreme psychological stress. Some individuals with diabetes may become suicidal if they have experiences of an overwhelming sense of powerlessness, hopelessness, isolation, or unbearable symptoms. People with disabling conditions such as diabetes that are attributed by others to their lifestyle choices or risky behaviors may experience shame, guilt, and blame, as well as problems with family members and friends. And as researcher has noted, especially in our health-conscious society, individuals with chronic conditions that are linked to unhealthy behavior such as eating unhealthy foods, alcohol consumption, obesity, physical inactivity are often viewed by others as weak, lazy, or irresponsible. Family members, neighbors, and co-workers often verbalize resentment toward these individuals. These individuals are often blamed by others for raising healthcare premiums, using scarce medical and healthcare resources, and increasing the costs of disability that are incurred by taxpayers. Blame from others may be internalized as self-blame that undermines willingness to participate in self-management activities. And now I'll turn it over to Deb, I believe.
It goes to Phil for the impact of diabetes.
I'll take this one, Deb. Yeah. I'll do this one, no problem. Continuing that impact, and folks, we want to just underscore here those external perceptions of people with diabetes. Anytime you have a disabling condition or a health condition that other people perceive you're the cause of, that it's your own responsibility, those conditions tend to be stigmatizing. Those tend to be accompanied by some people who blame the person for the lifestyle choices that they make, those kinds of things. That doesn't do us any good in healthcare delivery or in rehabilitation services. We don't get bogged down in the attribution of people's conditions, but people, in terms of attitudes toward people with disabilities, we know that the perceived cause of the disability has a lot to do with how people respond to it. Certain types of cancer, diabetes, anything related to lifestyle, HIV and AIDS is another example, highly stigmatized conditions, at least partly because other people view the person as at fault for their condition. And that gets internalized. So in working with folks with diabetes, we have to be attuned to that. This particular slide talks about barriers to employment that are certainly attendant to some of those reactions and the internalization of attribution for the onset of the condition. And we know that folks with Empirically, we know that people with diabetes are more likely to retire or leave the workforce before retirement age due to disability factors related to their functional limitations. Some of the functional limitations associated with diabetes that have been shown to bear most on job performance and job retention prospects include fine and gross motor capabilities, coordination, sensitivity of the hands and fingers in particular, fatigue, a big issue for folks with diabetes, relatedly cognitive and memory deficits related to fatigue, but also due to changes in the circulation of blood and oxygenation of organs like the brain. This becomes very important. Depression, not surprisingly, if you take into account the physical limitations and fatigue, and also the fact that this is hope we've established a pretty lousy condition, chronic health condition to have to deal with, and it is depressing and it is anxiety provoking. Visual impairment, as Dr. Lee mentioned earlier, these are the more common diabetes related limitations that pose problems at work. We see ongoing problems with people experiencing workplace discrimination on the basis of diabetes. And in some of the research we've done, we have reason to conclude that the discrimination experiences of workers with diabetes is different than those experiences of people with other kinds of disabilities, and indeed people with other kinds of chronic illnesses. We see prolonged absences from work as being a big issue. The lack of scheduling flexibility when it's not there is a big problem for folks with diabetes. When it is there as an accommodation, it's very powerful as a facilitator of job retention. We do know that workers with diabetes take 6 times. I want to say that again. Workers with diabetes take 6 times more sick leave than non-disabled workers. And so the need to attend to self-care regimens, to manage symptoms, to acquire the care that they need often takes them off work and requires employers to adjust to that. So requesting time off and using leave that folks have available to them becomes a very important part of the job retention process. And health and rehabilitation professionals can play an important role in helping workers with diabetes, arrange accommodations they need will allow them to stay healthy and stay employed at the same time. Next slide, Dr. Lee, diabetes and the Vocational Rehabilitation Program. This is a federally funded program available in all U.S. states and territories. And given the fact that 11% of all Americans are affected by diabetes, we know that vocational rehabilitation counselors and others with a stake in the employment of people with diabetes can expect to see large numbers of people with diabetes on their caseloads. If you work for a division of Voc Rehab, for example, for the division of the blind and visually impaired, you're going to have a significant proportion of your customers are going to have visual impairments due to diabetes, and they're also going to be dealing with the other consequences of this illness. So VR professionals, must be knowledgeable about the medical, psychosocial, and vocational aspects of diabetes, have to become familiar with proven return to work and stay at work strategies, along with the process of workplace accommodations, as I mentioned before, consultation with employers, very important, and with healthcare providers. And VR planning must include that interdisciplinary team, which includes general practitioners, nurses, diabetes educators, endocrinologists, everybody who's working with the person and providing support need to be involved. Certainly physical therapy, occupational therapy, rehabilitation counseling, mental health counseling, owing to the psychosocial adjustment that goes on there. So the interdisciplinary team to support people's return to work, stay at work effort becomes very, very important. And Deb, we're going to now walk through some phases of the rehabilitation process and specific implications for working with folks with diabetes. So Dr. Lee, the next slide says outreach, and that is Deb's.
Thank you. So with that outreach and the effort to recruit folks and education efforts, the VR program should be targeting first, individuals with diabetes, the endocrinologists, the other healthcare providers that are involved, employers, be they large or small, and HR professionals may also be a good resource in getting that information out. When recruiting, we need to keep in mind that individuals with diabetes may not identify as having a disability. So using language such as people with chronic health conditions to either replace that, people with disabilities or in addition to it is important. And all of the marketing materials, using that in intake interviews and talking about eligibility criteria. Would you go on to the next slide, please? Eligibility, focusing on VR professionals need to be cognizant of their own potential biases. Diabetes is highly stigmatized, and that goes back to what Dr. Lee was saying about how it can be viewed as it's the individual's own fault. And so professionals need to be aware that your own potential biases could negatively influence your decisions regarding that. So you want to keep those things in mind. You also want to look at an overall picture of what is going on for the consumer when you are making those eligibility determinations. Keep in mind that persons with disabilities are protected by the ADA even in periods of remission. So when making those eligibility determinations, it should be a combination of all functional limitations that the applicant may experience over the course of their illness. And that will help avoid misunderstandings when someone is having minimal symptoms. The other thing to keep in mind is it is important to screen for depression because of potential issues, because we know that depression is a common co-occurring issue with diabetes. Please go on to the next slide. And focusing on assessment and planning, flexibility is very important. Diabetes is chronic and it can be unpredictable as well as progressive. So you're coordinating with all involved. So the healthcare professionals, the folks involved with rehabilitation services, the individual, their families, the employers. We're looking across care settings and among multiple providers to ensure that appropriate and timely rehabilitation plan development. We need to consider the consumer's developmental stage. If the person is younger or middle-aged adult, keeping counseling in mind is important because individuals who've been diagnosed with diabetes may have feelings about that. They may have worries about the future. They may feel thwarted by their diagnosis. VR professionals may want to educate individuals about the psychological and physical benefits, as well as the risks which would come from the medical folks of continuing to work, keeping in mind on-the-job accommodations and how those can assist in achieving their career goals. We also want to include diabetes educators in the planning process, because that can help consumers gain a better understanding of diabetes and the importance of self-care and self-management strategies. For middle-aged adults, keeping in mind that they may be prematurely leaving the workforce or have concerns about how much longer they can continue working, they may benefit from job retention services and accommodations to be able to stay in their positions. For older adults, considering issues related to the longevity of their careers, fears about early retirement before they can afford to do so can help in the planning process and looking at those job retention services as well. And then also, if diabetes has become too severe, the consumer should be educated about employer benefits, long-term disability, or Social Security benefits that are involved. Identifying employment goals and that flexibility comes into play again because it may involve changes in career plans. And then referring clients to advocacy groups, self-help websites, support groups, and self-management training programs can also assist in this process. And with that, I'm going to turn that back over to Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Deb. And now we'll talk more about counseling and guidance. As we know, counseling may be important and necessary for individuals with diabetes to cope with the complex emotions that could be coming as they as they manage their diabetes. Many clients may still be skeptical of counseling intervention. So when discussing the possibility of counseling, rehabilitation professionals need to provide information that can reassure these consumers that their range of emotional responses is normal for their circumstances and commonly experienced by others coping with diabetes. Rehabilitation professionals can also use counseling and guidance to assist people to adjust to their disabilities, develop positive coping skills, acquire and use social support, and develop a sense of control over their diabetes. And these services not only can help them enhance their overall well-being, but they can also help prevent the onset of depression for those with diabetes. Rehabilitation professionals and consumers with diabetes can explore referrals to appropriate support groups, self-management education programs, and self-help literature to put their personal experiences into perspective and reduce feelings of isolation and alienation, and learn different coping strategies that would work well for them and other approaches to help them better manage their conditions. Counseling sessions such as self-management education programs and self-help groups can focus on a number of different wellness topics. Counseling services can also help consumers communicate about their illness to potential employers, trainers, or instructors, family members, and peers in a manner that is most likely to increase their understanding of diabetes, as well as their willingness to provide the accommodations and supports requested. Without appropriate professional or social support and education about how to manage diabetes, many people with diabetes are at risk of social withdrawal, feelings of hopelessness, and loss of control over their lives, and they may worry about their futures, and all these could further exacerbate their conditions and potentially cause depression. And with the pandemic, these psychological issues have become even more prominent for people with these type of conditions. Counseling can help people with diabetes to process the psychological effects of the COVID-19 social distancing requirements, and also help people with diabetes develop technological skills that enable them to engage with important people in their lives during and in the aftermath of the global pandemic. Follow-along services to ensure the well-being of these consumers are also critical. For example, a weekly phone call from one's rehabilitation professional can reduce the individual's sense of isolation and ensure that the working alliance remains strong. So next, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Job development and paid placement.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, it might be my audio, Dr. Lee, but you're fading on me a little. You switched it to job development and placement, right?
Yep.
Excellent, thank you. And just sort of underscoring what Dr. Lee said at the end of her section of these remarks, COVID-19 has thrown, a proverbial wrench into everything related to healthcare, to community participation, certainly to employment, and certainly just how we engage with one another and do business. But we are in the midst of a national labor shortage right now, and people with diabetes and with other disabilities for that matter are poised, I think, and represent a tremendous labor resource for employers who are, in some cases, desperately seeking to fill job openings. You know, we know that 50 million Americans had their employment interrupted during the first wave of COVID-19 in 2000. We think about 10 million of those people have never gone back to work and are likely not to. But at the same time, 20 million new jobs have been created during the next phases or waves of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have record low unemployment rates. We also have near record lows in labor force participation for all demographics of the society. And what that means is that for every job applicant, for every person looking for work, there are 2 open jobs. And so people with diabetes, many of whom are experienced, capable, qualified workers, who can, and if we can be flexible about working from home and telecommuting and the use of technology in particular, have a real opportunity to take advantage of the national labor shortage and continue working if they wish to, re-engage with employment if they choose to, in a way that meets our business community's imperative of having good qualified workers. With that, the first bullet on this slide, following my editorial, we see that it's really important to look at these issues of quality of life. They've never been more important than during the pandemic, but quality of life issues as it applies to employment. We think of employment as a straight line conduit to quality of life. And those of us in the field of rehabilitation, I hope would all agree that people who are working are happier, healthier, they have greater access to resources, greater social capital. It's a good thing to work and engage in the labor force. We get that. But it also brings with it some stressors and requires considerations having to do with the social determinants of health, like access to transportation, childcare. Is your housing situation stable where you could work at home if you needed to, et cetera? Do you have reliable transportation? Has diabetes affected your ability to drive? Do you have the technology you might need to work at home? Would you like to work at home? Do you want to engage out, or do you have concerns about returning to the office and possible exposure to COVID? Because if you have a pre-existing condition like diabetes, COVID can really complicate that condition as well. So people with diabetes have had to be very careful about not acquiring COVID. So the broader quality of life issues take on, I think tremendous importance given the current public health and economic situation that we're in. Very important to discuss those barriers that the person perceives to employment, if there are some, both at the individual level, barriers related to individual functioning, but also the environmental level. Access to transportation, as I mentioned, employer responses, coworkers, et cetera. Does the work environment have the safety features and accessibility features that you need to do your job? We also know that people with diabetes and other disabilities as well, for that matter, may have limited knowledge of their legal rights to accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, or to leave related to their health conditions, as in the Family and Medical Leave Act. So in many cases, we have to educate people about what their rights are and what legal protections they may have access to. We also want to begin the accommodation planning process as early as we possibly can, even planning for eventualities and contingencies by getting a good dialogue going with one's employer about accommodations that they might need. We really believe that cooperation and communication with the employer, if the employer values the worker and the work that they do and has a personal connection to the person and a personal investment in that worker's success and retention, then usually problems get solved and the person keeps their job. When the accommodation process breaks down, it's usually around issues of communication, not necessarily of unresolvable issues with job performance. So speaking of that, we'll go to the next slide, Dr. Lee, having to do with job retention, follow-up, and return to work services. So once someone is placed on the job, the need for on-the-job supports, also college or university training, These are very strong predictors of competitive and ongoing employment among people with diabetes. Do they get training if they need it? Do they have the on-the-job supports that they need to continue in employment? Very powerful predictor of longevity on the job. For people with diabetes over the age of 55, rehabilitation technology of all kinds. This could be communication technology that supports, working at home. It could be technology related to managing your symptoms. It could be technology, for example, to help accommodate your visual impairment, but a very powerful predictor of success for people over the age of 55. Why over the age of 55? Because as time and the illness progress, the incidence of health problems and disability increase for folks with diabetes, for people in general. Actually, this is true. And so the older you get, the more likely you are to need technology to help to accommodate health-related circumstances. So this becomes important in connections with our colleagues, Dr. Jacobs at the Job Accommodation Network, Dr. Hendricks and her team, certainly the State Assistive Technology Projects. These become very important resources in this regard. And as I mentioned before, perceived employer support. If you think your employer is supportive, you think your employer is receptive to your needs, you think your employer is cooperative and believes in the ideals of equal opportunity and universal design, guess what? You're going to be invested in that work role to a greater degree. You're going to be a more loyal worker. You're going to work harder to be more productive. You're going to call in sick less. And it's going to be a stronger bond between you and the employer, and that speaks positively to longevity pursuits. And what we know about people with diabetes, they tell us they want to continue, most of them feel they have the ability to stay in the workforce over time. They say they have the desire to do that, but they report significant concerns about the mechanisms by which to make that happen. And that's where work readership, it's where health professionals, physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech and language pathologists, primary care providers, healthcare professionals in all sectors of the field, people involved in vocational and employment specialists all have to come together in the multidisciplinary team approach to help people manage the medical, psychosocial, and vocational implications of this still increasing public health problem, and perhaps the ultimate emerging disability if we just look at the growing incidence and prevalence in American society and globally. Deb, the next slide brings us to the conclusion of our prepared remarks, and we're wondering if you will take us home, so to speak.
Absolutely. Diabetes, as we've just discussed, is a major public health concern here in the US and worldwide, and people with diabetes constitute a growing, underserved clientele that rehabilitation professionals would be able to assist. And each phase of the VR process requires careful examination of the medical, the psychosocial, the technological, career development, and community living issues that face these individuals with diabetes. And we've emphasized the importance of individualized case management and planning, employer consultation, the importance of workplace accommodations, the interconnection between the medical and mental health professionals and creating teams to assist consumers with diabetes in successful outcomes. So we appreciate your time and attention today. The next slide is our references. And Dr. Jacobs, thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to present today. And if there are any questions, please feel free to contact us, or if someone puts something in the chat, we would respond to that now.
Thank you so much to your whole team. This was really so interesting, and the importance of all of us health professionals and everyone in general better understand diabetes is critical. You know, I was taken by, Phil, I think you did that first slide defining diabetes and how it is different now, you know, when I first started in practice, type 1, type 2 was described differently. And I think all health professionals really need to understand that.
No doubt, Karen. And it's interesting that type 1 diabetes, we used to call it, remember, juvenile onset diabetes.
Right.
And type 2 was adult onset diabetes. Well, what's happening now, we're seeing type 1 diabetes occurring at any age. So it used to be if you got out of childhood without having type 1 diabetes, you weren't going to get it. Not so much anymore. And type 2 diabetes, which usually it was thought that it takes a long time for the pancreas to particularly by overtaxing it through the production of insulin, it takes a long time for the pancreas to sort of wear out in terms of insulin production. But not necessarily. We're starting to see type 2 diabetes in children, particularly children who have co-occurring obesity. So there are some real specific markers there, and the higher your body mass index, the harder your body has to work to process insulin and to metabolize, sugar in the blood, and that's what happens. So, and then you start looking at the demographics and the link to poverty and other lifestyle factors. We see that people who are already disadvantaged in other regards, health-wise and otherwise, are not perhaps, they're more likely to acquire, diabetes. And so we see that sort of double disadvantagement that occurs. But yes, Karen, it's a very different looking disease than it was, and it's affecting 11% of all Americans. Everyone knows someone who has it, for sure. And it's really a major public health crisis. And with the prevalence being as such it is, it's a tremendous, it has a tremendous impact on our economy, not just in terms of cost of care and lost productivity, but in labor force participation and employers' ability to keep, to find and keep good workers, and for workers' ability to keep going with the accommodations they need. So it's a very important situation for a group of people whose needs are really emerging and growing on their way up our social policy agenda.
Yeah, Phil, thank you for sharing that. I think it's important for all of us to better understand this. I was also struck by employment, and that, statistically, individuals with diabetes have a shorter span of employment. Retirement can be earlier, and that's just another variable that ties into the economy as well.
Yeah, the condition is usually progressive, and the earlier you get it, the more likely you are to have, over time you're going to get complications that require you to disengage from the workforce. What we'd like to do is help people to manage their symptoms as effectively as possible and provide the accommodations they need so they can keep working as long as they wish to do so. We want the decision to stop working to be the person's own choice. We don't want it to be because of health or accommodation matters, and that's about having the worker be as healthy as possible and getting the supports that they need. I'd be happy to hear my colleagues' perspectives on either of those things.
Yes, that would be great for another perspective, and also, what can we as healthcare providers, in rehab and occupational therapy, physical therapy, is there something that we as professionals can do?
Dr. Lee, when you encounter someone with diabetes, what's the first thing you'd want to look at?
Engagement in healthcare or mental health care would be important, because sometimes people may be resistant to seek care. They may think they're okay, but seeking care and then continuing with care would be very crucial to really help them manage their symptoms and help them improve their quality of life.
That's a great point.
Any other comments on that point? So Phil, you mentioned some resources. So someone's just been recently diagnosed with diabetes, and it's having an impact on their employment. You mentioned the Job Accommodation Network. What other resources would you suggest they seek out?
Well, given the kind of reciprocal relationship with health and employment, we would strongly recommend they connect with the American Diabetes Association. This is a great advocacy organization on behalf of people with diabetes. Should they require support groups and other self-help or self-management resources, that would be a great connection to make. We love it when our clients and customers get connected with diabetes educators who can help make sure that people are following the proper nutrition, exercise, managing and maintaining their health, because the better you do that, the better your prospects are for employment. I'm going to underscore our friends at the Job Accommodation Network. This is simply our nation's finest online employment and disability resource, bar none, funded by the United States Department of Labor. Just an incredible website and a free, toll-free telephone technical assistance service. You can call in with your own considerations. You can call on behalf of a client or customer. An employer can call in and visit Jan's website. They have a whole section devoted to accommodations for workers with diabetes and other chronic illnesses, and just visiting the site, very user-friendly, fully accessible. Can't recommend Dr. Hendricks and her team enough. As you know, Dr. Jacobs, Dr. Lee, and Deb, you know their work. Also refer to the State Vocational Rehabilitation Program, which we mentioned. Find out if you're eligible for services from that organization. This is a free service. It's not means tested. It's based on your need, requires an individualized plan for employment. You can access VR services whether you're employed or not employed at that particular time. And if you're working with a person with diabetes who is not connected to the state VR program, we recommend you do that as early in the process as you can. And finally, Karen, I'm thinking of the ADA Centers National Network. You have one of those regional centers right there in your backyard in Boston. There are 10 of them throughout the United States. They get contacts from about 2 million people a year, network-wide, provide all manner of technical assistance and support to people with disabilities, to employers, to providers of public services and accommodations related to implementation of our civil rights law for people with disabilities, the Americans with Disabilities Act, adata.org. And if you visit the site, it will put you in touch with your center that is nearest to you geographically. So that's another terrific resource that we would definitely commend to listeners' attention.
Phil, thank you so much. And I just want to thank you and your team for being on Learn at Work today, our webinar series, and for writing and publishing the column. And I'm wondering if we could take just a couple of minutes before we conclude just to talk about the column for a moment, because I think it's very important and we're extremely proud to be able to publish it in Work.
Well, likewise, we're proud to have the opportunity. So this is called the Return to Work Corner article series, and Dr. Jacobs has graciously allowed us to submit one article having to do with return to work considerations for people with disabilities for each issue of Work for the foreseeable future. We've had great contributors and collaborators from throughout the United States, and a couple of international folks are working with us on one of the papers as well, Karen. So anything having to do with return to work, stay at work, job retention for workers with disabilities. And the idea for this originated from a large Department of Labor grant we have called Retain Kentucky, a statewide initiative to help 3,200 Kentucky residents with disabilities stay in the labor force even as they cope with with non-work related injuries and illnesses. So that's our intervention model. and we're able to write about specific aspects of our retained model and how that connects with what's happening out there in the interdisciplinary research world around employment and disability. So if anyone had an idea for a return to work article they might want to contribute, they could contact me directly, and I'd be happy to chat with them. My email is there at the end of the slides, and we'd be delighted to do that. So likewise, Karen, we really appreciate the opportunity to do this, and we hope that Works readers are enjoying the papers. We're certainly enjoying putting them together.
Thank you, Phil. And I just want to thank everybody for today. We will have this webinar on our Learn at Work YouTube channel, so others who aren't with us right now will be able to listen to it. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to present on this very important topic that all of us need to be aware of. And I want to thank the people who are attending today for being here with us. So we're going to conclude now, and just want to thank everyone and wish you a meaningful remainder of the day. Thanks again.
Thank you all.